But yeah, today is all about enhancing learner engagement, and we're looking at it from an enrollment numbers point of view. So boosting enrollment numbers, conversion, embracing neuro-inclusion. Quite a lot of different subjects within that title, but we hope to cover quite a bit today. If you want to ask questions, Amber, Purlos marketing exec, is there, and she can take them during the webinar. Happy to take them at the end of the webinar as well, if you like, if you want to ask any questions. Otherwise, you can just sit back and listen to some of the insight that we're going to go through.
We'll see you on Monday at 10:30. Thank you.
So, yeah, if you want to ask questions, you can either shout them out or you can type them into Teams. But today we have Helen from Cognassist with us, which is fantastic. And Helen, you're jumping in for Louise, who's off away at the moment, which is a shame, but it's fantastic that you jumped in at the last minute. Really good. So just to introduce myself, I'm David. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Purlos, and I'll give you a bit of an overview of Purlos in a minute. But Helen, if you just introduce yourself and maybe a little bit about Cognassist and what you do.
Yeah, of course. Really happy to be here. And Louise is very sorry that she can't make it, so I'll be taking over. So yeah, as a science communications manager, it's kind of my role to communicate what we do. Like all good science communicators, I like to inspire a bit of awe and interest in the subject that I'm involved around, which is neurodiversity. I'm definitely not a physics expert, can't be Brian Cox these days. But what we do is kind of we work in education and the workplace to support neurodifferent individuals, to support neurodiversity, to bring awareness and understanding, training, and we offer a cognitive assessment and support platform that kind of follows in education that kind of learner journey. So not many people might think learning engagement is a neuro-inclusion subject, but it very much is, because it's about designing this personalized experience for learners and thinking about how individuals learn. So that's kind of where we're coming from, and that's really my role and how much I love talking about the subject.
Yeah, great. Well, you're definitely you are the the name for neurodiversity in the industry. I think that's what I've heard from so many people that I've met. You said neurodifferent, neurodiversity, neuro-inclusion. Maybe for people who don't know what it is, can you explain what it is?
Yeah, so neurodiversity is kind of really a social paradigm. It's about understanding that our neurological differences are not inherently good or bad. They're just different. Some people experience challenges in certain areas, but there are also benefits that we can think about. And it is kind of about balancing the scales and making sure that there is wider accessibility, wider inclusion for just the different ways that our brains function. We're very complex. The human brain is the most complex system that we know of in the known universe. So we're dealing with something that is incredibly complex. And it's just a natural fact that we're all going to be very different in how we process the world around us. So neurodiversity is really an acknowledgement of that, a movement of that. And when they're talking about neurodifferences, these are people who are more likely to experience more significant differences in some areas. They might need more tailored support, and it's kind of acknowledging that, yes, there is this broader diversity, but there are also specific differences that are going to have more of an impact on our daily lives, and that's really where that's coming from as well.
Yeah, and I never used to know much about this, but one of our staff members a few days ago literally brought up the fact that they had a learning difficulty, say, and that actually did cause issues, and then after getting help, it made a big difference to their life. And there's actually quite a lot of people with these hidden issues, I guess, and the benefit to your product is that it can help them and identify them, I guess. So correct.
Yeah, and I'll put my hand up as well and say that I'm autistic. I just got my diagnosis January this year, which has been an incredibly positive thing for me, and the support that I'm now sort of getting in place and the understanding that I've got about myself throughout this process has been completely invaluable. And I really kind of do owe that to Cognassist, because when I was younger, my brother was diagnosed at 17, very classic, men always get diagnosed earlier. And because that support was in my household, I kind of got missed and I benefited from that. But it wasn't as obvious. Women are very different to men when it comes to autism. Not all of us, but it usually has some kind of defining characteristics that are sometimes quite different. And it's really about that growing awareness and how that can drive a level of self-understanding, self-compassion that also, you know, goes beyond the learning journey. These are things about ourselves that we can use in our daily lives, and thinking about how we process information. But of course, I would say here that Cognassist isn't a diagnosis tool. It's about learning difficulties in particular as well. So autism can co-occur with learning difficulties, but it's not a learning difficulty in and of itself, because it's more around the behavioural, social aspect and the fun masking that you get with women as well sometimes.
Well, that's useful. That's useful to be specific about. I wonder why they find it in men earlier. Yeah, interesting. I'll ask you another question, but I'm quite keen to kind of be quite punchy and move along at a certain pace. So we've got the agenda, which will come up in a second. I'll give a very brief overview to Purlos. So Purlos has been around nearly 4 years now. We work with further education colleges, universities, training providers, and also government. But our aim is to increase learner engagement and decrease learner dropout throughout different stages of the learner journey, but mainly admissions at the start of the learner journey and destinations, tracking, and alumni at the end of the learner journey. So we created a digital assistant which connects to learners through better channels, things like WhatsApp rather than email and phone, which haven't been working as well recently. And we do that to get better data to push people through bottlenecks for admissions or get better destinations data after a learner leaves for our clients. So that's what we do. And I think that's probably a good segue just into asking you, Helen, about different types of organizations. So Purlos works with lots of different organizations, but you also work with FE colleges, training providers, apprenticeship providers, universities as well. And we've got everybody from all of those organizations watching the webinar today. I guess a question would be, do you see any differences in how they use your product or find learning difficulties, those different organizations? And if so, you know, what?
Yeah, so there are some slight differences in kind of the delivery of this. It's kind of, we aim to be flexible and work around teams, their resources, the kinds of whether they have dedicated learning support teams or whether they're kind of tutor and enrolment teams. But our assessment is essentially part of the initial assessment process. So it's kind of usually done at reasonably the same time during that enrolment stage, so that you can get the support plan in place, agreed by the learner, agreed by the employer, and then it's kind of ready to go when they start. As I said, the differences we do see is with the kind of delivery of the teams, putting it together, the timings of certain things, but usually from the quality perspective, we're looking at that enrolment assessment, support plan in place, and then the monthly reviews, which is kind of really from a compliance side of things. We'll talk a bit more about that, but generally the structure is kind of the same. We can tailor delivery and all that of when these things exactly happen, and that's kind of with the provider. But yeah, it's that kind of, and it also we've got an API that integrates with different LMS systems as well. So it's kind of about, it's a mix of that compliance side of things, which learning support really kind of needs. It needs that structure, it needs that standardization to make it effective and to support teams in their roles and reduce that kind of stress and workload on individuals. But then it's also, because it's like any software, it's a flexible system. Yeah, we really do work around organizations and what they need.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I'm just trying to think, because you've got, it depends how you look at the different types of clients that you've got. You could look at it by industry, market, university, college, training provider, or you could potentially look at it in terms of funded learning or non-funded learning type. So it could be 16 to 19s, AEB adults, apprentices. But you're saying you can basically plug in anywhere, which makes,
yeah, and we go from AEB level all the way to level 7 degree apprentices, so we can tailor that support and that the reasonable adjustments based on really a wide range of kind of levels and the knowledge and skills and behaviors that those kind of learners might need to gain, you know, management, effective leadership skills, a lot like soft skills for employability that can often get missed within the core curriculum, but are kind of, they're still very core skills that especially neurodifferent individuals might not be able to pick up those unwritten rules of the workplace. So, and they get to pick and choose as well what kind of things they want support in more than others. So it's kind of providing that flexibility of based on skills as well as a level of need.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I'll go through the agenda, I think. just briefly. So because we've got so many different types of organizations watching, we're thinking about how to fit in both your products and our products, which work at different stages of that journey. But we're just going to look at it from a learner engagement journey side of things. How do we see a learner engagement journey that would fit for all types of post-16 education provider? Look at the learner support journey. I think you'll probably take the lead on that, Helen. We'll then look at updates to learner support funding, any of the funding changes which can drive a lot of behaviors in especially funded learning providers. Look at Ofsted, which is always an important thing, and how you could potentially evidence support. From a Purlos point of view, we'll look at Ofsted and look at why they're so bothered about outcomes and positive destinations. And then we'll look at the learner engagement journey in terms of 3 different sections. So enrolment challenges and potentially some suggestions over applications, conversion improvements that you can take away with you. A few challenges around learners being on course, which you know quite a lot about, Helen. And then talk about alumni destinations challenges. What happens when your learners leave your organization, and how much do you really know? And why is it becoming important? So yeah, so the learner engagement journey, I mean, you can look at it a number of different ways, but I think what we like to do at Purlos is think about what problem are you solving? And there's a lot of different problems you could solve for different education providers at different stages of the engagement journey. And you could really cut each of these sections down into multiple sections, and every organization becomes quite tailored themselves when you get down to the minutiae. But if you're looking from a top level view, learner engagement journey for pretty much any post-16 education provider in the UK, globally, is pretty much seen as 3 stages. So where are they before they start? I guess you'll be looking at applicants there, pre-enrollment. While they're on the course, what are they doing during their study, which is obviously key. Probably the biggest problem out of all 3 stages is retention. How can you keep learners on your course? It depends on your organization. But I remember in universities and colleges in America, there was a 61% dropout a couple of years ago. There are issues that are widespread, and it's also a very complicated problem, retention. Obviously, we're not going to solve it today. You know, in attendance, behavioural issues. You know, is the curriculum right? And then the 3rd stage would be after learners leave, which some organisations take really seriously. You think about Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge University. You know, how much money Harvard will be getting reinvested back into their organisation from their probably pretty rich alumni, down to, you know, organisations that don't have enough time, money, resources to really create that alumni program. Then potentially there might be some big benefits for them. So it's, where do you actually sit in this picture? Where does your product help learners out of all these stages, and how?
So we put a lot of focus on the enrolment stage, because that initial assessment really, you know, sets that learner up for success, and everything kind of flows from that, the whole plan, the whole learning journey. We are also very much focused on the retention side of things during study. Interestingly, the Department for Education, they did some research into reasons for non-completion for adult learners, and often there are multiple reasons, as you say, but often one of the most commonly cited one was a lack of support, and the course didn't feel as relevant to them as it could have. So it's something that we are very aware of, and just to add to that, the National Achievement Statistics, National Achievement Rates tables, there we go. They show that learners with learning difficulties and disabilities are more likely to drop out than their peers. So when you look at it, average across the board of everyone, I think it's something like, oh, I've got it right there, 64%. And when you're looking at learners with difficulties, you're looking at 61%, which might not seem like a lot, but that is, you know, that's a significant number of individuals. We're dealing with, you know, hundreds of thousands of learners across the whole country. So yeah, that's where we kind of see, and we do kind of work both with educators and employers. So there is a bit of crossover there, but we're still kind of, we're very much focused on that learner journey. And I think you're kind of more focused on their past, when they've actually left. And a lot of the focus where we put is past that gateway point where, especially with learning support, you've had the support program in place, then it gets the endpoint assessment, and the reasonable adjustments fall through at the very last minute when they're needed most. So we're also focused on that post gateway section when the learner's still on program, you know, they still haven't achieved Am I on mute?
No, we just lost you for about 2 seconds. Reception, but yeah, just go back.
Okay, great.
5 seconds. Just rewind.
I was just saying, so we're kind of more heavily on that identify piece with the retention, but we do also kind of have that the kind of post gateway part of it as well. That's just before a learner leaves, you don't want that support to fall through at the last minute with reasonable adjustments at endpoint assessment.
Yeah, so you work a lot with apprentices, right? And I think it was an FE Week article a couple of years ago. I mean, it's constantly been talked about in paper, and there are some big changes going on in the apprenticeship world, which people will know. The Labour government, if it gets in a year and a bit, which is potentially likely, that's what Nick Titan from Nick Kime from Titan Partners, big education think tank, said yesterday at one of the EdTech Week events. It's going to change a lot of things. Hopefully, will be quite good for education, but could be quite complex. But the issue with apprentices, I think it was 2020 to 2021, they had 42% dropout. So, people are dropping out whether they've got learning difficulties or not. It's a bit of an issue, I'd say. And you said 64% of people that had learning difficulties would drop out when they're on course, or drop out during the enrolment process and the application process.
So it's a mixture. I think it's kind of the once they've enrolled stage. So the average retention rate is about 65%. These were totals from, it's difficult to remember because they didn't do 1 year. I think it was the 2019 to 2020 ones, because those were some of the last statistics that happened before COVID. So it's 65 average retention total. And then it was a 63% average retention total for learners with learning difficulties and disabilities. So there is a definite difference there. So it's something to think about. Of course, in the complexity of dropout, it's not going to cover everything, but it is just another aspect of this kind of very broad issue affecting the sector. And it's interesting you mentioned the kind of changes happening, because I think it's especially with support, it's kind of really coming through. You've got the national SEND reforms, you've got the national autism strategy. Ofsted are really on this. They're we're seeing a lot more in their framework and their inspections. So yeah, we'll talk a bit more about this as we go, but it's definitely a occurring theme.
Yeah. Might be good to think of a couple of examples, I guess, because we've got a few themes running through today. One's learner engagement, so it might be worth thinking about, maybe an example of learner engagement, or how do you think about engagement from a Purlos point of view? It's kind of multifaceted, really. Our system will connect to learners through WhatsApp, and what do we call learner engagement? We measure response rates, how many people get back to us, which is about 3 to 4 times more than standard channels like phone, text, emails, that kind of thing. But a response rate isn't necessarily engagement. So we measure engagement by how many messages there are after that initial response. And then once you've got engagement, it doesn't really matter unless there's a good outcome after the end. Are they actually converting to an enrollment, or are they being retained on course? How do you think about learner engagement?
So the way we deliver support is kind of through monthly strategies. The learners engage with these strategies, and they review it with their tutors on these monthly reviews to figure out if the support is working, what they can implement, if there's, if they're receiving reasonable adjustments, are they working, do they need to be changed? So it's engagement with that support, and we track the engagement there. It's also achievement rates. So lots of our clients have seen increased achievement rates. We have Bradford College saw a 10% increase in achievement rates. We had Realise, who have 100% achievement rates for LDD learners versus non-LDD learners. So equal achievement and equal opportunities there, which is amazing to see. So it's a mixture of on-program engagement with the support, engagement with their tutors, a willingness to have these conversations and kind of think about and kind of voice what they need, and be really, and kind of work with tutors. And often we'll see the most success when it's kind of built into standard processes, so learners don't feel like it's something extra that they have to do, or something. We kind of phrase it from a "this is how you learn" side of things, so we can talk to the learner and have that conversation based on their assessment results, and that's the point where you really uncover the challenges they might have had previously, if they've had support at other stages of their education journey. And it's often a way for learners to actually go, oh yeah, wow, that explains a lot. And we've had a lot of kind of stories from learners that speak to that.
Yeah, well, this learner support journey is what we're going to go through next. I think we can go through that with you because you've got a very set structure around that. But in terms of learner diversity and I guess learning issues, if you call them that, what kind of things do you see? What kind of learning issues do you see?
So what we look at specifically are different cognitive domains related to these learning difficulties. So cognitive assessments, if you don't know, they're kind of usually part of diagnostic assessments for things like dyslexia, dyscalculia. We look at areas like information processing speed, verbal reasoning, literacy, numeracy, kind of hitting those. It's more the processes behind those functional skills. So we can learn strategies and we can learn information to support us in our functional skills, but the kind of the cognitive processing side of things is much more kind of fundamental and will impact those skills in a way. So it's looking a level deeper than that. So just to look at this support journey, this is from the quality assurance framework that Cognassist developed with Mesmer around learning support, providing that structure for learners who might experience more challenges with education. And it's kind of taking that sort of standardized quality process and ways that you can audit your current processes as well, ask questions, investigate kind of the processes that you use. So identify obviously being that initial assessment piece, also looking at the kind of how you attract learners. Do you have clear kind of policies in place that people can look at? Do you have I lost my train of thought, but it's the kind of accessibility side of things, that first step. Are you saying, showing that you've got this, that you've got what it takes to kind of support your learners, support a diverse range of learners? And everything sort of flows from that, really. So you've got the planning. I'll go through that a little bit with the kind of more compliance side of things. There's support delivery, the structure for that kind of works usually on a monthly basis. So you're catching up with learners all the time. You're having these conversations. You're reviewing that support and just making sure that it is working for them and it's what they need at the time. And you'll sometimes find that you can toggle off and on the support. People aren't always going to need support in education. Neurodifferences aren't kind of inherent to always requiring support. And I think it's about being aware of our assumptions, but also creating a bit more compassion and understanding of why a learner, might be disengaging, what's causing those behaviors. If there are behavioral issues like you talked about earlier, it gives you another level of kind of investigation to be like, okay, well, you don't want to make assumptions, basically. And it's all about that preparation for not just endpoint and that kind of assessment piece, but the wider skills of what this person's going to do afterwards, how they can use this information in their daily life and build that kind of resilience and self-led learning as well.
And this is all digital from your point of view, is it? Or do the colleges, training providers embed this with the kind of face-to-face plan?
So the quality assurance framework is all digital, and it's a module on their platform. And from Cognassist's perspective, yes, we have the platform. A lot of the support is delivered remotely. Learners can access the assessment from a laptop or computer, and they can do it unsupervised or supervised, depending on how they want to do it, and also how providers tend to do it in their own processes. And then obviously the monthly reviews, they kind of have to happen with a member of staff, whether that's their tutor, whether that's a coach, whether that's learning support staff. And that can be, it can be a team call, it can be remote, or it can be face-to-face as well. So it's kind of, but there's always that human element required. So, it's looking at, yes, you've done the assessment, but how are you going to talk about those results, having that conversation with the learner, that needs assessment piece, which we also, help tutors or members of staff to talk through as well, giving advice and kind of guidance there. So yeah, it's a bit of both.
Yeah, I think the thing is you need both, right? But there's only so many humans, especially with a budget of being able to afford so many staff at X cost, especially in further education and training as well, where recruitment is a bit of an issue, recruitment of staff. So we message students quite a lot during the first 6 weeks if we're working with further education colleges, because it's quite a big dropout point. And I guess the issue there is when everybody's starting college, it's pretty hard to go around and tap them all on the shoulder and say, are you okay? So we used to do that just with a quick WhatsApp message. And so sometimes you need scalability, I guess. Okay, great. Well, we'll go on to updates to the learner support funding, talking about Ofsted in general from Purlos' point of view, from your point of view. What are some of the updates in terms of learner support funding?
Yeah, so it's really great that you mentioned the kind of staff resources, stress on staff numbers and all that kind of thing, because it absolutely, that human element is important, but it's about reducing that strain, and also that funding that is, the learning support funding is there to kind of offer support there, financial support for when you're having extra time with tutors, if you're implementing adjustments to learning, endpoint assessment adjustments. That's what this funding will cover. So I'll just go over the biggest changes that have kind of occurred, which is as of the 1st of August this year, it will be mandatory to do a screening exercise for learning support funding. And so if you've got learners enrolled now who are going to start, then that piece also needs to be done for those learners now ahead of time. So that's just a quick tip there. This initial assessment is because the learning support screener exercise and the following needs assessment, that's kind of the more deep dive into how those needs are going to impact your learners' progression, their likelihood of completion. That initial screening exercise is an eligible cost charged to the employer, but that further evidence-based dive with the learner that is kind of part of agreeing the support in place, that's not an eligible cost. So it's just understanding how this is broken down, really. And we spoke to Lisa Smith, who's the Risk Assurance Director at RSM UK. So we've got some good webinars there if you need any details. But yeah, and it's also the kind of new thing that's quite interesting is that the provider and the employer must, with the support plan that you've put together, the reasonable adjustments, they must reasonably expect that the apprentice will successfully achieve based on the support and reasonable adjustments, and kind of have documented evidence of that as well as part of that initial evidence requirement. So I think when you're dealing with sort of under-resourced teams, that, sometimes it can feel a bit crass to kind of talk about learning support and funding, but budget should never be a barrier to getting the right support in place. So and often it's a confidence thing for staff as well. We find that people are doing the support, they're putting the support in place, they've got these, it's there, but it's that there's that fear of kind of the clawback issues and exactly what's required in the evidencing, and just being a bit unsure there, that prevents people from I think it was Stuart Segal, who's one of the board members of ALP, said, providers have it within their gift to access this funding to support their learners, to provide that dedicated, much needed support. And I don't think simply enough people are using it.
Yeah, it is really important. It's like everything in funded learning anyway. The government come in and they might give you some funding, but then there's usually some paperwork and some extra work, maybe some extra updates to the individualized learning record, some extra work for teams that are sometimes under-resourced already. So I guess being able to do it digitally and simply and quickly is really important. And that last point about the provider and the employer must now reasonably expect the apprentice to successfully achieve based on a support plan and reasonable adjustments. So they need to reasonably expect the apprentice to successfully achieve. I think that's kind of a core message that is behind one of the big messages we've seen from a funding point of view. So our destinations tool, it was always important, but now it's becoming more important, and destinations will always be important. I think one of the key things that the government is looking at is, okay, we've given away a lot of money for funded learning, for apprentices, for skills boot camps, for many different projects, Multiply, AEB, adult learning. And in certain areas, maybe it hasn't been as efficient or as effectively spent as possible, which not necessarily anybody's fault. It might be the way that certain courses are structured, but the government wants to start seeing more around impact. If you are putting somebody through an apprenticeship course that's a year long and you get paid 95% of your funding at the end point, then where's the motivation to get that person into a job? And if you look at apprentices a couple of years ago having a 40+% dropout, and somebody who might go and do an apprentice for Centrica might not actually end up in an engineering or similar role as they were supposed to be, and they might not end up working for Centrica after the apprenticeship finishes, and they don't a lot of the time. So can we make the money that's given out to funded learning providers more impactful, I guess? And that can kind of be seen in a number of different ways. So for FE colleges, they have got a new FE performance dashboard, and a couple of changes have been made to it. They need to now start measuring things like employability, what kind of impact you're having on the learner. We give you a bit of an example. So we work with the Learning Curve group. They used to track destinations on the phone for 40,000 learners. And now they do it through our system, through WhatsApp. It's completely automated. The first half of our questions when we ask learners about their destination is basically, what is your destination? And there's 4 things. There is employed, unemployed, apprenticeship, further level of education. The second half of the question set is about what impact you're actually having on the learner. And what the Learning Curve group did is tailor the questions to see whether they've had an increase in salary, responsibilities, but they put one thing in their questions, which was, have we improved your life? And so X% of people on X course for the Learning Curve group could say that the course they've been on has improved their life, and they could track those people into jobs and whether the course that they were on actually gave them any skills for the job that they ended up in. Do you get my point?
Yeah, absolutely. And we also have an example, which is it's good to see, basically. So we had Skern, one of our clients, go through successful ESFA audit with no effect on their funding for learning support, and their key messaging in we've got a case study on our website of it, was that really showing that learning support journey throughout, and kind of having, you really just you need that documented evidence of your reasoning of why that support's in place. If you're just looking at reasonable adjustments right at the end, it's not it's likely that your application might be denied or things like that, because there's not that clear sort of support throughout, and that journey and that reasoning of why that learner requires that support. And it really is about supporting providers as much as possible with the knowledge, the tools, and the frameworks to make it easier, make it give that kind of structure and a bit more confidence, really, for all aspects of that journey.
Yeah, just a small point to make on Ofsted. That's mainly for the training providers, apprenticeship providers, the schools, colleges, not so much for the universities. So we work with a few universities now on destinations tracking, and it's very similar, but there's also quite a lot of differences as well. So they align to the 11 categories that the Office of Students want to see in the data. And even though they do want to track destinations, they don't actually go into the impact because Ofsted's not inspecting them. What they're very keen on is they have a graduate outcomes survey at 15 months that HESA and JISC will run and to find out what's happening. But that's 15 months where somebody could be unemployed after having gone through a 3-year course. So we triage conversations to the careers teams for the universities, but it depends on who your regulator is and how your funding works, and even if you're funded at all, because obviously people pay for themselves at universities. So, but the main point is for colleges or apprenticeship providers, training providers, anybody inspected by Ofsted or universities who are regulated by the Office of Students. The end goal is to give the learner the best outcome. And if you look at, even if you look at Ofsted inspections, the way that they inspect all different education providers, the impact aspect of the education inspection framework, the EIF, it just talks about outcomes, outcomes, outcomes. There's a specific sentence. It says, learners are ready for the next stage of education, employment, or training. Where relevant, they gain qualifications that allow them to go on to destinations that meet their interests, aspirations, and the intention of their course of study, i.e., if you did a hairdressing course, you ended up becoming a spaceship engineer. Maybe it wasn't that great. Maybe you could have, you know, got there via a different route. I even heard Pearson's director of product yesterday talking about pathways and predicting pathways in the future, and that it's just going to become more and more popular. So yeah, a few things to think about anyway, but that's kind of useful. And these are a couple of specific things that you highlighted. We can go through quickly.
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, we're seeing this conversation around SEND becoming much more central to Ofsted. So it's things like the quality of education, that intent piece. It's mentioned within the education inspection framework that it's accessible and designed for all learners to achieve the best outcomes. It's also talked about your compliance with legal duties with the Equality Act 2010, and that inspectors are looking and to assess this compliance as well. We had our client Education-Wise, who they were a relatively new provider, had a monitoring visit that was required improvement, and they knew they were kind of still really getting set up. So they knew where they wanted to improve, they knew where they had to plug the gaps. So they came to us to talk about putting Cognassist in place, and they did with us a 12-month Ofsted turnaround, got the official call, and received outstanding on their first Ofsted inspection. So it's really within that inspection, the inspector was looking at pass rates specifically for LDD learners versus non-LDD peers, and kind of, you know, seeing the comparative success and achievement there. So it's very much within the outstanding criteria, looking at those SEND achievement rates. It's in the Ofsted literature, it's in the handbooks. Often we say that, you know, all of the information is there from an Ofsted perspective. If you're looking at the resources from their side of things, it gives a lot of clues to what they're looking for, and that intent, implementation and impact sort of journey is also part of that quality assurance learning support framework. We've really tried to create that continuity and quality within that process that's kind of from a compliance side of things as well.
Yeah, makes sense. And I definitely urge everybody to start thinking about impact. How can you evidence that you've impacted your learners in a positive way? So we'll go into enrolment, we'll go into on-course study, and we'll go into alumni or destinations just a little bit more, a couple of specifics, and then I think we'll just end up after that, Helen. So from an enrolment point of view, we'll go through a few points separately, but, you know, jump in whenever you want. I guess there isn't any specific answer to not enough enrollments. I guess one of the questions is, does everybody want infinitely more enrollments? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, sixth forms we used to work with, they only have specific space to fit more students in. You know, they might fit an extra 50 students in a sixth form college, but you could fit another 1,000 in a further education college. And then it's broken down for some of the colleges into courses. A lot of colleges actually get oversubscribed for very popular courses like STEM or even plumbing and electricians, where they're very popular courses. But then there'll be certain courses like hospitality, retail, the industries that are struggling that might not always be full. So it's not always just getting more enrollments. It's probably worth thinking about that. And obviously, in terms of, think about a college or a training provider, if you get somebody that is on a medium to long course and they're just not the right fit, it's maybe not the best idea just to get more and more enrollments, because they'll drop out later after the 6-week period, and then your retention will be worse. And that's a very important metric, especially if you think about all the cost of supporting learners later on. So in terms of not enough enrollments, what things can you do? I'd say the main message from Purlos would be that it's potentially worth getting more applicants, obviously, but there's a lot of macroeconomic and UK-wide things that affect that, not in the least things like how many babies are born. So until about 3 years ago, the number of children born was going down greatly across the UK. 16 years before, so 16-year-olds going into colleges was going down. And then a few years ago, it jumped back up again. So it's on the increase up to 2030. But that's an example of a macroeconomic factor affecting applications, enrollments, the number of people at the right age available. So you can use things like learn and find companies. A lot of our clients, training providers, apprentices, colleges use those kind of organizations with differing success, I would say, some better than others. We used one called Market Smarter, which was a good company. But I guess if you are getting within 5 to 10% plus or minus applications each year, and it's not going massively up or massively down, where can you go from there? And I would say you can increase conversion. So how many do you actually know your conversion rate? If you are a training provider, in terms of typical kind of conversion rates, depends what kind of learners you have, whether it's a bit different for apprentices because of the complex way that they come on board. But if you talk about adult learners and AEB providing training providers, usually people would be applying through your website or your marketing channels, and usually there's quite a high volume. Typical kind of conversion rate we see would be in the single digits, 2 to 5%. But thinking about how to improve that just by a couple of percent could massively increase the final enrollment. If you look at a college, from application to enrollment, our average conversion rate would probably be anywhere between 50 and 70 to 75%. And so there's huge potential just to work a bit harder at converting the applicants you have already by understanding the bottlenecks, which we'll talk about later. So I don't know if you've got anything to talk about there in terms of where your learners find enrollments, or maybe supporting learners better. It might be better for you to go through the second point, just so we can finish on time, Helen. Admissions, learner support teams being busy. This is something that we see a lot. Have you ever, seen teams that you work with be under-resourced, overly busy? Is that an issue, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a lot of the reason why people talk to us in the first place. They are looking for, they know that it's an issue. Usually they know that it's a gap within their provision of that kind of support piece and compliance piece. So they're really kind of looking to do that in a manageable, scalable way. So yeah, we really do see that. And I kind of, yeah, it's an ongoing thing. I know I represent Cognassist and I absolutely love what Cognassist does, but I always would say, do your research, have a look around. You really want to, whatever your processes are, whatever your kind of journey, it's about that learning piece. Sometimes learning about Neuro-Inclusion, learning about inclusivity is part of that, as part of that broad education piece. But I will say that we had Rent-A-Kill initial come to us, and they've said if it wasn't for Cognassist, our send support strategies for reasonable adjustments would not have been able to be implemented. 17 learners would have had zero chance of achieving without the support, and Cognassist has been the catalyst. And it's that looking at that initial assessment piece, having an evidence-based approach, and that also showing that you, as a provider, when you're looking at bids and tenders, you've got this differentiating piece around that learner support. Employers are really keen on ED&I. They want this diverse talent. So how are you kind of guiding that talent to the workplace, essentially? Yeah.
And I think learner support teams are usually there in colleges and training providers, also universities, I guess. Admissions is more of an FE college team. Usually when we talk to training providers, especially if it's adult learners, usually it's more of a sales team or a learner engagement team, but the issues potentially the same. Some of the biggest benefits we've had are just the automation. So how many repetitive queries do you get, whatever type of education provider you are, and how can you automate them? And we've just seen the patterns, and we automate sequences through WhatsApp, and they'll just roll one after another. And it's just pretty efficient. So finding learner needs early, I think this is quite an obvious one, but this is something that's important for you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the kind of things that we'll see with providers is that they are reliant on this kind of self-disclosure of needs. A lot of learners won't do that because they're worried about the impact it might have on their ability to get on the course, their relationship with the employer, if you're kind of working in that apprenticeship sector. And it can have a really detrimental impact on their learner journey and engagement. And they'll often find that the problems happen later at the course when it's almost too late to do anything about it. So it's about having that upfront knowledge. You've got the tools in place, the early interventions where you need them, and kind of efficiently allocating resource. So we have a kind of support likelihood rating that's based on the level of need. So, you know, if you are dealing with, you know, that kind of, if you're struggling to identify the needs and the level of need and all of the kind of resources tied into one, it's about looking about how you can have the most impact, the learners that are going to require the most support, and really tailoring that provision. But that identification piece is kind of the most important, because it leads to kind of all of the things down the line, and getting that learner to a place where they feel confident, they feel, so we actually run some research which was looking at confidence and motivation of learners. When we initially assessed them, they were less confident in areas where they had identified. So in related skills like communication or writing, should it be literacy? And what we found is 3 months later, with cognitive support from their provider, that they on average increased by confidence by 14%, and they increased by motivation to learn by 16%. So this is, and it kind of ranged across, you know, 5% to 50%. You know, it's kind of, and it's building that that confidence really, and it's about that early identification and going, okay, now we can just tailor the course, and the learner, like, it all feels fluid and seamless for the learner, and they can build that confidence.
Yeah, good. Well, I think we can talk about a couple of those points in the next couple of slides. Don't want to kind of double up. I'm going to go through a quick slide on bottlenecks and nudging, because this is just something we talked about the last few years. So this is different for a training provider or even a university or a college. This is a college example, but I'm going to talk about training providers as well. So somebody would apply for a college, FE college, it's 238 in the country in November. The early people would start applying then, all the way through till September when they enroll, and then they have the first 6 weeks of the course, which is key. So where are those bottlenecks? And if you are trying to increase enrollments, how can you maybe improve the conversion? A lot of the colleges would have a huge number of partial applications. There's 4-page applications for the colleges. What if somebody's gone halfway through? Do you know about them? Are you actually trying to get them finish them off those applications? So we've had a lot of success there. Events is relevant for every education provider. Typically for a college, you would be an applicant, go to one of those events, and you would fill out a piece of paper potentially, or maybe go online and fill out an application form. But if somebody's filled out an application form, are you sure they're going to turn up to enrollment? No, because half the time they don't. So can you nudge them after that to figure out how much they actually want to go, and if they've got 10 other colleges or they've got 5 jobs they want to go to instead? So that's quite important. We actually send a message to figure out whether that college, that training provider that they want to enroll in, is actually their top choice. Do they have other choices? I'll give you a couple of examples. So with the colleges, there's a big dropout during interviews. Training providers don't typically do interviews, but with Hopwood Hall in Manchester, they had a big dropout. It was something like 42% of the students dropped out of the first 2 interviews, and we got 32% of them to come back in after. And half the reasons were because they were just a bit disorganized, they didn't see their email, not that they didn't want to go, and it was just the engagement and communication channel. Our biggest ROI message is when people don't go to enrollment. And we got 222 extra students for BMET College last year. During the first 6 weeks, there's a load of different messages you can do, but it's usually about being happy and being anxious, just checking in. If you're a training provider, it can be a little bit different, depending on, you know, if it was an adult education funded learner, it might be that you have certain minimum criteria that those learners have to meet, like having simple maths or English GCSEs, and you know that you can't work with XYZ learners. So we worked with sales teams before just to filter out those learners instead of spending a lot of time speaking to humans, when at the end of the day you know that you can never put them on a course. So these bottlenecks, I think, are quite important. So that just gives you a bit of an idea where potentially you can improve. I think we'll just roll on to the next slide now. So personalized support plans, reasonable adjustments. Do you want to give us a bit of an idea? Because this is mainly your kind of area on course. We'll probably be quite brief, I think, Helen, quite tight on this. We've still got this in the next slide to go.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I think I've talked around quite a lot of this thing. One thing I will say around the kind of learner engagement piece, especially when it's support, especially when people might be, you know, not keen, not interested. It's it's kind of really about how you phrase that, and the kind of the positivity that you can bring to that conversation often has quite a large impact, and talking about that it's really about designing a course around them, building finding the relevance for them. So ways that we look at learner engagement on course is kind of we have these flexible learning plans, which allows the learner to choose support strategies that are that feel relevant to them, that feel relevant to their current sort of course subjects, or even sort of challenges that they're kind of facing, things that they're looking for in the workplace, that sort of area. And we have the ability to increase or decrease the level for those modules. So if a learner's on a level 3 program, for example, and they're finding it a bit stressful, a bit overwhelming, you can decrease that level. Equally, if the learner's like, I'm not getting as much value out of this, I want to challenge myself, then you can increase that as well. So it's really about looking at the kind of what that learner needs, what that learner to engage them in the process of learning, engage them in that self-discovery journey about kind of learning how to learn almost, and learning skills, workplace skills, soft skills, and also kind of supporting challenges they might have, communication challenges, behavioral challenges, looking at those kind of areas and how to build effective coping strategies there. And it's written in a sort of simple, informative way, giving lots of examples, kind of making it as easy to understand for the learner, and kind of at their level, whatever level that would be, to build that kind of confidence piece and keep that proactive engagement there.
Yeah, so being flexible and proactive. Yeah, a couple of examples. We mainly do stuff during admissions and destinations, and we want to solve a problem. So the problem we solve in admissions is getting more enrollment, converting more learners. In destinations, it's tracking more of your learners, a higher percentage of known destinations. Do you know where people are actually going before you fix the problems of getting them into the right place? Didn't do as much during on-course because the problem there is retention for us. But we did do a number of different things that were quite interesting. So we worked with West Nottinghamshire College, and we sent a message out saying, hey, what learning difficulties do you have? And this was ages ago, and it's not our focus, but we said, what learning difficulties do you have? Press 1 through 9. I think there were 9 of them. And I guess the point was, because they had poor communication channels, they didn't figure out that these learners had XYZ issue. I think dyslexia, dyspraxia, etc. And it links into confidence as well. When the staff from West Nottinghamshire found out, there was 74% of students on this pilot that said that they wanted more help during the first 6 weeks of term. And imagine if you go in with dyslexia, dyspraxia, and nobody knows, then you can get pretty unconfident, especially after COVID or during COVID. Higher likeliness of dropping out, we found. And in terms of proactivity, we did another trial with Solihull College in one of our WhatsApp inbound chatbots. So it's fully automated. You could go and see it on a leaflet and say, right, go to WhatsApp, press get started, type in get started. You can even spell it wrong, and we'd come up with a million different questions about what kind of support you needed, and it was very scalable. So I think being proactive is key. Learner engagement wise, I think I'll probably just talk about this one quite briefly. It's probably our bread and butter. So last 2 years, we've A/B tested about 80,000 messages to 16 to 19-year-olds, 19 plus adult learners, apprentices, and different learners. And I think what we've seen is the different channels, like WhatsApp versus email versus phone, etc., work in different ways for different learners. We've also said that different tones and messages, we've actually designed those conversations for the learners and tweaked them, and a question mark here or there could increase response rates by 15%. So the tone and voice is different for 16 to 19-year-olds compared to kind of 19 plus or over 50s. More professional for the older learners. And in terms of data, we figured out when different people were messaged. So the 16 to 19-year-old students were most responsive at 9:35 on a Friday, when the staff from the college aren't there. So in terms of learner engagement, the channels, the tone, the messages, the time of day that you send messages, they're all quite important. Tutor and learner relationship, this is quite important for you, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's kind of building that understanding of where there are challenges, especially things like behavioural challenges. It's about building that piece of compassion about I talked about it a bit earlier, about what's kind of going on behind those behaviours. How can you kind of, when you experience learning difficulties, learning at best is kind of this frustrating process, and at worst it's just completely traumatic. And what are you going to do in those situations? You're going to disengage. So it's kind of about understanding what's underlying those behaviors, because people don't always know. That's the point of the identifying the hidden needs, is because it's looking at what's going on underneath there. Is it learning challenges? Is it, other reasons? And that it's important to think about this holistically. It could be, mental health, it could be home life, it can be learning difficulties, but it's just a way to give you another tool to think about these things. And when you were kind of talking about the retention piece as well, so we've done a bit of because we're working in data science, we have the ability to use that in predictive models. So we've done a bit of research with 2 clients, that's Realise and Multiverse, and we looked at previous cohorts of learners who's at greater risk of dropping out. And we've found, not surprisingly, that learners with identified learning needs are more likely to drop out. And we also found that using these kind of AI modelings, that we were able to predict dropout with about 80% accuracy. So it's using this data really effectively, understanding the challenges of learners, and it's looking at a multitude. The more information you have about a learner there, the more the more you can understand also the areas that are going to impact these measures more. So it's looking at learners that dropped out versus learners who completed, and what are the key factors of that, the kind of correlating, I think they call it, the statistical, common statistical denominators, basically, that dictate whether or not a learner is going to drop out. And there's a huge possibility with that, because we're also doing research around functional skills, learners who are less likely to pass their functional skills. It could look at, with employers, you could look at learners, who are more likely to secure certain types of jobs, with the proviso, the kind of ethical use of this to then provide the support and get that kind of tailored support plan in place to get these diverse learners through to completion and through into the workplace, where they, there's a lot of talk in the business world about the innovation, the creativity, the out-of-the-box thinking, the higher risk management with diverse teams, with neurodifferent staff, that they can see the benefits. So they're looking for this talent, and it's kind of being part of that kind of whole society as a whole, building this understanding, changing people's lives. That's kind of, it's a really important part of that journey.
Yeah, makes sense. I think some people will be going on to meetings potentially, unless they want to be getting an early Friday off. But we'll go quickly through the next one. Confidence, a very big thing that I've just heard more and more recently. The National Numeracy Organisation was doing some work with the CPCA in Cambridge and Peterborough, who we work with. And they were talking about one of the key things that their findings was that the level of confidence massively affected the ability to improve maths skills. And I've heard this just all over the place. So I'll go on to the next slide, but I think in confidence, it seems to be very important in a number of different areas. And you just might want to think about how you measure the increase. We're measuring in one of our new products, how confident did you feel 1 to 10 at the start of the process compared to the end? So I think that's going to be more and more important. I think I'll go through this mainly, and then you can give a couple of points, Helen, but after that, we'll let you go and we'll give them the QR codes to the next webinars and go from there. So yeah, Purlos has a product called Destinations, and in terms of managing transition points when students leave, it's a key one. I think that was an area that you could potentially speak to, Helen, and then I can talk through the rest.
Yeah, I think that it is when somebody is kind of being passed from provider to provider, whether that's a school, whether that's a college, whether that's universities, there's a real risk of that drop off of support. And it's kind of, it's it's about all of us kind of pulling together to make that a much more positive experience, to reduce the stigma of disclosing. And part of that is just kind of about making it more standardized, more normalized, talking about neurodiversity, being very open about the process and kind of looking at it from that positive standpoint to help manage those transition points and give people the kind of empower them with this knowledge and make them feel empowered by it, rather than like, oh, I don't know if I can say this, I don't know if it's going to impact my career chances. You know, this is it's part of that wider journey, and giving people that, not just the confidence in the kind of process of learning, but the confidence to be like, these are my needs. And you know, it is both a legal requirement and something that I wish to have, that I want my needs met, and giving people confidence to have that conversation and really, you know, empower them to feel like they can have that conversation within your sort of provider enrolment areas.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different transition points, but it's key to keep engagement. Those long-term engagement is hard. It sounds like a pretty obvious sentence. Just a quick example on this: talking to universities a lot, and they try to, you know, drive alumni programs, maybe slightly more than the colleges. Coventry University, probably one of the most innovative universities. When talking to some of the bosses about their strategy, it really is about lifelong learning, and I don't think a lot of education providers really think that they can keep those long-term connections in tow. But the idea was, if you can keep that long-term connection and people are changing their jobs more often, you could sell them another course. And it sounds a little bit selfish, but if it helps that learner and they can reskill, because they're going to need to reskill more often when robots keep automating different roles, then long-term engagement is hard, but it's going to be important. So think a little bit more about that learner afterwards. Tracking destinations by phone doesn't work. This is the main problem that we've been solving for years, but this is also the main way that people still track destinations. So you're not going to be able to help people get more jobs or into more positive destinations unless you track their sustained destinations in a better way. So yeah, stop doing it by phone is my suggestion. And then I guess the last point is poor data to predict dropout or success. Not everybody has this. You've got quite a lot of data on predicting dropout as you're doing these partnerships with City and Guilds and other companies, Helen. You can never have perfect data. Most of the education providers have so much to do. They're constantly working with data. But maybe just look into the data, where it's weak, where it's strong, maybe work with third-party partners. The main data points we work on with the destinations product is, number one, what is the percentage of known destinations, i.e., do you know where your learners are going? With an average college, they would not know where about 50% of their learners are going, and they would know where 50% of their learners were going because they either stayed with the college, they went to a corporate with and did an apprenticeship, which they had a link with, or they could get that data through UCAS if they went on to uni. So in terms of percentage, you really want to be going to about 80% plus. That's what Ofsted said they were looking for, is good 80% and plus known destinations, and that'll improve in the future. But also make sure you measure the impact. I don't know if there's any last points you want to add, Helen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just to think about identification rates from that Ofsted compliance side of things. They need to see that data. It's very easy to have these processes but not have the kind of raw data there. But we're finding that generally clients have quite good, if there's good data management, which there usually kind of is, you can amalgamate it and you can do a lot with it. And sometimes it's just the putting it all together and doing something with it that is the really difficult part, because you've got things all over the place, you've got lots of information in various places. So it's kind of yeah, we like to work with providers to kind of do that for them, because it's a very big challenge. Like, we do see more and more providers, you know, have their own data science teams, and that's amazing and that's great. And I think we're only just going to see more and more of this, because, you know, evidence data driven impact is true impact.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just texting somebody because I'm late for my next meeting. It was a bit ambitious, but thought I could do one straight after the webinar. Anyway, there's still loads of people here, so something must have been relatively interesting, and it was great to have you here, Helen. You stepped in the last minute, spoke really well, super interesting stuff, and hopefully everybody found it useful. There's a couple of QR codes here in case you want to go to one of our next webinars. There's the Cognassist and Mesmer webinar are discussing the quality assurance framework. We're running one with HubGem that works with education providers to basically engage learners through all different stages of the process, mainly through HubSpot, which is becoming very popular in FE. If anybody's got any questions, feel free to shout them out now, or you can send them to either ask@purlos.com or sales@cognassist.com, and here's links to book a demo as well. Just check there's no questions. Feel free to put one in. Otherwise, thanks a lot for attending. Impressed that people are still here, and hope you have a good weekend.